All right, welcome to this seminar organized by the John Cabot University Institute of Future Innovation Studies in collaboration with the Festival della Diplomazia, Diplomacy 2020. First of all, I want to express my thank you to the organizer of the festivals who have been incredibly helpful in supporting this event. In particular, I want to thank Giorgio Bartolomucci for organizing this, and Georgia Ferris, I think name, apologies if it's I'm wrong, for helping organizing all of this. The theme of the seminar, as you might know, is the global AI race, the geopolitical dimensions of the AI race and the European human-centric model. We are going to discuss the contemporary and evolving and increasing competition that there is in the field of artificial intelligence and its geopolitical dimensions. But before we start and I introduce the presenters, I would like to give the floor to Franco Bragoncello, who's the president of John Cabot University, and then we will follow.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Francesco. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Franco Bragoncello, the president of John Cabot University, and I want to give a very warm welcome to our prestigious panelists and to the participants who are following us on Zoom of this very interesting conference on the global artificial intelligence race. I also want to give my thanks to Giorgio Bartolomucci, the president of the Festival of Diplomazia, for this great initiative. The tension between technology, power, freedom, and control is as old as humanity. A tension which invests everybody's life and has forced through time a search for acceptable, ethical, and social solutions. In fact, the more sophisticated the technology, the more complex the understanding of this tension and of its possible solutions. And I think that the internet is a clear example of this. With its initial promise of increased freedom and democratization, which has turned into a worrisome reality of centralized control in the hands of private organizations. Artificial intelligence is the new and even more complex frontiers for this dilemma, since it creates an environment in which machines' intelligence is further removed from human control and knowledge. Faced with these challenges, it is important for our global society to devise as best as it can rules and levels of transparency which are as uniform and clear as possible. It is undeniable, however, that today the development of artificial intelligence is following regional and national trajectories which respond to specific interests and risk creating new tensions and divisions at the international level. Discussing these matters is thus of paramount importance, and conferences like this one are a timely and most useful occasion to identify and analyze the challenges we face and their possible solutions. So I thank you again for being with us today. Many thanks to our distinguished panelists, and I give back the floor to Dr. Lapenta. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to introduce the people that are going to participate in this conversation. You might have seen them on the program. We have Paul Nimitz, who is the principal advisor in the EU Director General for Justice and Consumers. Guri Esselbeck is the co-founder of the think tank Data Ethics.eu and a member of the European High-Level Group on Artificial Intelligence. Gabriele Mazzini is the legal and policy officer at the European Commission. Professor Carolina Aguera is a professor of sociology at San Andreas University and the University of Buenos Aires. Stefan Sogner is a professor here at JCU and is also the director and co-founder of the Beyond Humanism Network. Enzo Maria Lefebvre Servini is a project leader at Digit, European Commission, and is a member of the executive board of the Fondazione Adriano Olivetti. Kondaine Kaliwo is the Chief Information Officer at the Malawi Agricultural and Industrial Corporation, and is also a member of the IEEE P7000 group on ethical considerations in AI standards. And Elena Malikova is part of the Directorate General for Competition and European Commission. Myself, I'm Francesco Lapenta, and I'm the director of the John Cabot University Institute of Future Innovation Studies. So the conversation today is gonna try to unfold the very complex dynamics that are characterizing what I call the artificial intelligence race and the geopolitical dimensions of this race. Now, we're all familiar with the incredibly dramatic and powerful dynamics that are have taken the world by storm in the past few months. Well, the pandemic and the COVID-19 crisis has exacerbated and increased the language and competitiveness and the tension possibly between geopolitical powers that have identified in artificial intelligence the next stage for global leadership in technology. So the race for artificial intelligence started probably decades ago, but we can certainly argue that the conditions and the effects of this race are going to be more and more visible these days. Now, I would like to start to discuss with the panelists your opinion of the current Chinese stance on the path to the development of artificial intelligence. You probably are familiar that President Xi, I think was in May, but as recently as these past few days, have announced to the world a dramatic shift in the global policy of China. I mean, since the economic development of 1978 in China, there's been a distinctive Chinese model that was described by the National Development and Reform Commission that talk of the Great International Circulation Strategy. The Great International Circulation Strategy wanted to position China as one of the economic forces providing the structure, the infrastructure for the commodification and the process of industrialization of all the other countries around the world. They opened their barriers to accept investments and to welcome all kinds of investments and productions from the West and from the rest of the world. It's been an incredibly powerful and effective strategy. Within a short number of decades, the geopolitical position of China has changed dramatically. The core strategy for this 40 years was this open interaction with the West, and specifically, there's been an axis with the United States, and of course also Europe. She a few months ago, talked about it, and they're discussing it right now. He suggested a shift in policy, and he's been talking about a dual circular economic model. It's a dramatic shift that implies a greater competition with the biggest competitor, that is the United States. And the model implies that China is going to try to become independent of dependencies from other countries for pivotal areas of technology, such as microprocessors and other kind of elements. They have been delegated to other countries. And they also declared a total investment in artificial intelligence, which they have identified as the next area of competition. Now, I'd like to discuss what your view is of this shift in policy and what might be the consequences Is it just an economic posturing? The interdependencies between the US, Europe, and China are economically too complex to disentangle? Or do you think this transformation, this indication of changing policy is only the beginning of an increasing and more problematic competition between economic and cultural models? Perhaps, Paul, you can tell us what you think.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to this very important and very timely discussion. I have been over the last years usually twice in China, one for the EU-China mixed committee on justice issues, and once on a, let's say, more academic mission, visiting the EU university in Peking, and also visiting some other academic institutions, but also the headquarters of the Communist Party for International Relations. And so I would like to say, first of all, that as far as academic wording and papers is concerned, which are then, by the way, also fed into our EU justice by the Chinese government, everything sounds very good. And one has the impression that really, let's say, there are intellectuals in China, in academia, and in the ministries, and obviously in the companies who follow very closely the developments of real technology, but also developments of discourse in politics and academia. So I think there are definitely people in China who know exactly what's going on all these different levels. When it then comes to, let's say, common projects or conclusions, the matter becomes much more difficult. China has been putting in place laws on protection of privacy and internet security, and I think there is an understanding in China of the problem that technologies like AI, which do not work according to the rules, which, for example, in Europe we have put in place for protection of fundamental rights, non-discrimination. I'm talking about now secondary legislation. I'm not talking only about the great principles in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights or the European Charter of Human Rights and data protection. So I think China has an understanding, the government and the companies have an understanding that they must comply with these rules when they want to make money in our markets here. And now I would like to come to your geopolitical issue. Of course, China, to this prince, has seen an aggressive stance of the Trump administration. And of course, now what's happening in the area of TikTok by the Trump administration is a quite amazing American shift, because let's not forget that America is much more than China has been until now, the big transferer of personal data from elsewhere in the world to America. Not even China, but now with TikTok entering this type of activity, but previous to TikTok certainly not, was able to collect through its private companies, and I'm talking about Google, Facebook, and so on, this huge mass of personal data, and then transfer it back home, so to say. And on the way of transfer back home, of course, the National Security Agency is there and copies it all and does with it what it needs to do with it in its eyes. And this is the private-public surveillance complex, which is a complete normality in America, and which America has fought hard when I negotiated the Safe Harbor Agreement and also the Privacy Shield, the Safe Harbor follow-up and the Privacy Shield, we had huge problems to get the US to commit. And as we have seen, the Court of Justice, the commitments were not sufficient in the eyes of our court. We had huge problems of the US to commit to what is necessary to protect individual rights in this global world of data transfers. And now the US shifts around, not nota bene in the name of protecting individual fundamental rights, but in the name of national security. Trump has declared this a matter of national security and says, we don't want that TikTok collects all this personal data here in the US and then transfers it to China. So I would say in this triangle, it's a very, very complicated situation for China now. And my feeling is there is a willingness to learn and a willingness to adapt to the rules which we have in Europe. In the US, actually, the level of protection is much lower. But this is a baseline also for the ensuing development and regulation of artificial intelligence, because, of course, one of the great issues is and will continue to be which rules does AI have to follow when it processes these masses of personal data to understand people, to do medical developments in pharmaceuticals, in treatments, in schooling, and so on. Every time, we're talking about we're talking about artificial intelligence related to human activity, whether it's in policing, in education, in health, we are at the same time talking about personal data. And so I think we live in this respect, first of all, in an age of concretization and enforcement of existing rules. And this enforcement will increasingly be pretty tough. And you can see first signs of enforcement in United States, the Federation. So I think here, this, I'm sure, is watching this very, very closely and is under wants to continue. It needs to comply with these rules. So I would like to stop here now and just say, China has to make up its mind whether it wants technology which can scale, which don't care about protecting individual rights, or for that matter, protecting democracy, or whether it wants to be a technology player which is able to trade and sell also with the free democratic world. And then it has to be complying with our rules. So the debate which we right now have on Huawei and the related security questions, which is largely, not exclusively, but largely a hardware debate. This debate, I think you can extrapolate it into the questions of software and AI. And, I would say AI falls under software. It's learning software by all means. And China will have the same problems in that area if it doesn't learn fast enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, I mean, to build up on what you say, it is absolutely true that the United States have, for a period of time, been the greatest collector of data. Now what is emerging, though, it's two different scenarios. One is that in which you have the United States that are collecting a lot of personal data, mostly for forms of, I would call, consumer surveillance. So that's one model of collecting data for the sake of following the users for businesses and economic purposes. Now the China model is becoming dominant in selling a surveillance model where the data collected are used more than for the economic purposes for social control. And that model is becoming very successful in their ability to sell artificial intelligence tools to surveil citizens. I think I read somewhere that up to 64 countries and states have acquired this kind of form of surveillance systems. Now you have these two very powerful dichotomies. They're both based on data, but they're also based on different values. And China is offering also an alternative model to the US model, because what they're basically kind of providing to the world is a successful social economic model that seems to be based not on democratic values, but another set of more authoritarian kind of values, where technology is directed by governments and rather than by commercial competition. So my question, perhaps for the panelists and for Gabriele specifically, is how do you think Europe kind of fits in this fight between two giants, and where do we stand, and do we have kind of the ability, both economic, technical, to be independent or to counter these two dynamics? And what is Europe doing, you think, in kind of reacting to these dynamics?
Yes, thank you, Francesco, and thank you for the invitation. Yeah, definitely. I think this is indeed a very interesting position, so to say, to be for Europe at this time. And I think that so far, indeed, Europe has demonstrated quite a bold stance in addressing this question. And doing it as I think once the executive vice president said, our own way, in the sense that indeed Europe doesn't intend to place itself sort of in this global race by following one model or the other, whether this is China or whether this is the United States, but really to propose something that, you know, it's consistent with who we are, with our values that Paul was referring to before, and to propose indeed what we would call sort of a truly European human-centric approach to AI. And yeah, perhaps in this respect, I can give you and the panelists and the viewers a little bit of an overview of indeed what that looks like. As the Commission published recently, well, a few months ago in February, a white paper on artificial intelligence aimed to put together, to support what we call an ecosystem of trust, of excellence, and of trust. And the white paper essentially has these two dimensions, the trust and the excellence, which should work together. So the idea is to support an approach, a European approach on AI, a value-based approach on AI that can rely both on excellence, which means essentially having the technical and capabilities to actually develop AI in Europe, and trust, which means having the right regulatory environment where these technical capabilities can actually emerge. So the white paper identifies a number of actions in both these areas, both in terms of investment, uptake, upskilling, creating so the opportunities for research to happen in Europe, for products to be developed in Europe and to put to the market in Europe, and at the same time working in parallel with with creating this ecosystem of trust that essentially refers to the regulatory framework. And so I focus a little bit more on that in this discussion about the governance of AI, which essentially, if you want, when we talk about governance, we want to indeed talk also about the values that you want to give to a certain technological approach through also regulation, intended as a broad sense. I don't necessarily mean legislation. And so the Commission put forward a number of policy options in February in the white paper on ways in which it could fulfill this commitment made by the President von der Leyen in her political guidelines when she was appointed President of the Commission. She promised to put forward legislation for a European approach on AI. And so a number of ideas that we put forward related, for instance, to what is what kind of risks we want to focus on. And here it's very clear that emerging risks that this technology brings are mostly related to safety when it comes, for instance, to AI embedded in products, but also to fundamental rights, as Paul was mentioning before, which come in very different forms, as AI is essentially a general purpose technology that can infiltrate in all sorts of economic and societal environments. So one key component is the definition of what is the risk and how do we define the risks. So what we consider a risk sufficiently important to warrant a regulation. We also indicated a number of possible requirements that should be, we think, should be imposed on these systems that pose high risk. Requirements that tend to be pretty much aligned to a number of core principles that are almost universally recognized when it comes to the regulation of AI. So around the data, so the data on which the system has been trained, about the documentation of the system, so record keeping of both the data as well as the methodologies and the design tools, transparency, so transparency vis-a-vis the end users, but also transparency as regards the system, robustness and accuracy, so robustness, the ability of the system to deal with perturbations or omissions or errors so that it can somewhat perform still safely. And then human oversight, which is essentially really making sure that the system performs well, depending on the circumstances, if needed, with actually a human in the loop. So to come to a conclusion, so that I want to give you a quick snapshot of actually the reaction we got on this paper. So the white paper was published in February. We launched a consultation which ran over the summer, and then we got over 1,200 responses. So we've actually been literally flooded by interest and papers that we are now running through. And there has been a clear support for a regulatory approach at EU level. Essentially, only 3% of the respondents said that there is no need to do anything. So the greatest majority that said there is a need for a new regulatory framework or at least intervene in existing regulatory frameworks. As regards the risk that I mentioned before, almost 90% of the respondents were concerned about risk for fundamental rights, including discrimination. And almost the same share of respondents expressed concerns about risk for safety, so how AI could endanger physical safety. I also want to highlight there was a lot of concern expressed with regard to what you just mentioned, biometric identification, so facial recognition systems or other systems that use AI and certain particular sensitive data to identify a person. And here, indeed, there have been 28% of the responses even say that we should consider a ban on certain systems like facial recognition. So I leave it here for now and can complement later if needed. You're muted, Francesco.
Thank you very much. This is the kind of it describes quite well the circle that and the tensions that are created, right? So Paul was describing the competing dynamics in the collection of data. The fact that the United States have been collecting data systematically, and they keep doing. And China now is trying to create a competing model, and the US are trying to resist. We have an authoritarian surveillance-based technology model of Chinese doing, probably made to control and organize an incredibly complex society and guide the evolution. Then you have the US model, and you, Gabriele, described this principle-based European model that is becoming so popular. And probably that kind of helps me to discuss the role of the soft power regulation, which the EU seems to becoming the competing strategy and leader, basically. I remember when we started discussing about principles, no more than 2 years ago, it was incredibly complicated to identify these principles. And as you said, now there's much greater clarity in it. And Europe seems to be leading that conversation about regulations and principles, and countries seems to be following, including China and the US. But I'd like to ask to Carolina and Condaine and Enzo. So how do you perceive these dynamics from different geopolitical spheres? Carolina is working in Argentina, and Condaine is in Malawi, working for an organization that is trying to promote innovation in Malawi. And very many times, it seems that in this global geopolitical debate, those forces are either unaccounted for or not referred to. So what is the perception and how do you feel from your own kind of cultural base, the global conversation?
Yeah, okay.
Who will jump in first?
Condaine.
Ladies first. I come from a tradition that puts women first.
Okay, thank you, Condaine. Then I will start. So yes, I'm Carolina Guerre. I'm actually now in a period in Germany until September next year. So I'm still affiliated with my university in Argentina, but I'm currently affiliated as well with the Center for Global Cooperation Research at the University of Duisburg-Essen, and this also brings a perspective regarding my interests, and I would like to see, as we were having this exchange before the actual roundtable started, to look at AI and at the potential for cooperation, global cooperation that we can see here. Particularly because when we think of AI, as Gabriele mentioned a while ago, I mean, we are thinking about a general purpose technology that has been developing for the past nearly 8 decades in scientific communities, and science and technology communities tend to have this ideals about cooperation, about sharing. And I do want to bring in here, for example, that AI and all the problems that AI is generating in this current context come about are embedded in this hot political power, technopolitical and trade war. But if we look at, for example, the development of internet protocols in the 50s and 60s, and we're looking at, I mean, one of the hottest periods in recent history, they were all, I mean, scientists were sharing their knowledge about IP protocol networkings, technologies. And I think that if we just inscribe all this language and these debates in the struggles and the tensions, then we are just not seeing how AI is also actually working in scientific communities, in international conferences. And I just don't want to be naive here, because I mean, we also can see, digamos, my Spanish came in, just leaked. We can also see how there can be a reading about trying to, let's say, particularly from China, to participate in Western kind of conferences in general in these debates. But firstly, I would like to say that we have a scientific community, and we do have it in the global south as well, and many scientists and scholars working on AI from an engineering and a mathematical perspective. I mean, they see themselves as part of this larger epistemic community. So this is one thing. But we also have to integrate the narratives about AI and from a global south perspective, in terms of the existing divides that have already been mentioned earlier, regarding the use, the development of digital technologies. So a lot of what of the current problems and the tensions that we are seeing nowadays with AI come about because of the use of platforms, internet platforms, and that have captured massive amounts of data over the last decades. And this has already generated this very asymmetrical capacity in these two regions, the US and China, and leaving the rest, I mean, Europe with its strong tradition in regulatory enforcement and normative vision. But as for the rest, I mean, and the global south in particular, what we are like, we have to understand how we get connected, how we get the skills there. And we also have to choose. I mean, the debates we're having in particular in Latin America is we don't want the US model, we don't want the Chinese model. The European model looks lovely, we like it. How are we going to implement it? And actually, and having some conversations with some colleagues a couple of days ago, I mean, we say, okay, probably one of the most interesting instruments that Europe has developed recently, which might not relate more strongly with AI, probably in this group now, is Gaia. I mean, GDPR has been very much discussed about being something that that connects the tradition, the regulatory tradition of Europe with the values of trust and the protection of personal data. And we are seeing the movement of all most Latin American countries in terms of trying to be compliant and adapted to this framework. And this is perceived as morally as the way to go. But then strategically, I think there's a great potential in also developing this kind of cooperation on infrastructure, which will enable, I mean, not just on paper, our problems are always not just the norms, but how to implement those norms into infrastructure. So really, I mean, this is, and when I was saying initially that I wanted to be a little bit provocative, but Gaia is a project that is open to other countries, to other businesses outside of Europe, etc. And we were thinking, okay, maybe this is a way of thinking that maybe Latin America is a region that is trying to grapple with where to go. I mean, it is strongly being invested by China. I mean, there's strong Chinese investments in many areas, and not just raw materials, but also in science and technology. The whole 5G debate is also coming in here, and China is adding a great pressure into some of the decisions that many policymakers in the region are facing, or are unwilling, or they do not want to listen to what civil society is claiming. So we are seeing in Latin America, despite civil society efforts, we are seeing that Chinese technology, referring to AI facial recognition, is being adopted in certain urban contexts. And I will say that the city of Buenos Aires just approved one a couple of weeks ago. And this is Chinese technology. So what are we going to do with the already embedded...
Sorry if I interrupt you, because
yes,
we're kind of short of time. And perhaps I want to take your last comment to contain it so that you can follow. So what is it okay, Carolina? Or
yes, that's wonderful. I'm sorry, I was too passionate.
She mentioned the penetration of Chinese technology and models in Latin America. And so I wonder, what is the situation in Malawi, and what's your perception of the situation in Africa? Are you also on the fence looking at models that you can kind of adopt, or?
Yeah, well, thinking about the question, Africa is really a master at consumption, so we've looked at technology really as an end product. Someone develops it, and then we look at it, we shop around, we see which one is most suitable to us. And because most people in Africa are trained from the West, the tendency has been to look towards the West for solutions. And I know just recently there's been a growing number of people going to China for education. So you'd expect that maybe in the next 10 years or so, there will be a strong voice promoting technologies from the East. But as it stands now, China was seen as an alternative of cheap solutions. So the attraction was to say, well, I've identified something I like in the West, but I'll look to the East to see if I can get it at 10 times cheaper. But because of the fight, I think it's brought in an interest to policymakers to say, what's this fuss about? Why is AI such an interesting thing? And why is data important beyond just protecting the privacy of the users? And now, because there's a clear indication that there's economic value to this technology, I'm beginning to see that the discussion at policy level is changing, that it is important to start thinking of developing our own technologies, not at the same scale, obviously, but to the point that we can trap the economic value. So you can see that there's kind of a transition from just consuming these technologies to the point where we're beginning to ask questions as people that have the capability to develop the technology. So I'll just quickly mention, for instance, if you look at the areas of agriculture, it's clear that the way we are approaching it is not being effective. We can't feed our own people, and we are victims of climate change. There's need to develop something else, and clearly technology is the way to go. And from there, it's obvious that we have to go the way of AI. In that regard, it means that whoever will be able to promote the technologies that are most suitable to us as a partner, as a supplier, will gain more visibility and attention. So if, for instance, there are these tendencies from the East to just cannibalize or just take resources or just give you something in return for money and really not giving you the ability to grow and use it for the benefit of the populace, I don't think that those technologies will gain much ground. In terms of health, again, there's need to digitize the service provision, because right now we don't have enough facilities, we don't have enough systems that can support our people. And the pandemic that we're just emerging out of it has really brought the issue to the fore, in that governments are aware that if we don't have the local capacity to take care of the health systems, you could lose your economic power within a short time. So again, there'll be that look towards technologies that can be able to assist with that. Virtual clinics, for instance. I was part of a group that was looking at establishing virtual clinics, but that was last year. So the end part of it was still a human being, but that could reach into remote areas. But with what has happened, I can see that there will be need to adopt technologies that can now assist beyond the human capacity that we have. Surprisingly enough, I've always thought that technology will be something that's difficult to embrace in Africa, but it's not. If you look at things like cell phones, anyone uses cell phones, whether you've been to school or not. And already these gadgets are using AI. As long as it's seen as something that is something that you can trust, something that makes your life better, the debate will not really be there. But I was thinking that perhaps once people begin to take the data and start manipulating people to buy products and to alter their behavior and the way they use, perhaps that at that point, people may start worrying at what the technology is doing. But in general, there are several areas where you see that the technology will be embraced. Most likely to me, it will still be from the West. And right now, the people that are pushing it forward, it's the banks in the financial sector, as well as in the telecommunication, that are popularizing the use of cell phones, even in the most remote areas.
So, building on Carolina's and Condaine kind of comments, perhaps Enzo and Francesco Grillo. Enzo, you specifically are a bit of a transcultural expert, because not only you lived everywhere, but you also have kind of connections with Latin America. So how do you read this kind of tension between the necessity of adopting technology for the betterment of society, industrial production, and the kind of a struggle of choosing a model of values that is produced somewhere else, because it feels that Latin America and Africa specifically are struggling to have a voice in governing the evolution and of the technology, and they're more in the position of adopting what is available. Is there kind of something? And sorry.
No, just go ahead if you want to ask already to Francesco something, and then I.
Because it gives context to what you're saying, because Francesco is an expert also on kind of Chinese, on the Chinese model, and he has what I consider also a very positive and proactive interpretation, because he's trying to look at what can be adopted of the Chinese models in, for example, in Europe and somewhere else.
So if I can go back to your question and to the inputs that have been already given to this conversation, I think that looking at the wider perspective, I would say that we have a two different kind of race. So there is a race of the first comers, and I briefly remind that this whole race started politically with Putin's word in 2016 when he said who will govern AI will govern the world, in a way, and it all started there when both Obama issued the very first report of the White House on artificial intelligence, and then it developed throughout Europe in understanding that since 2017, let's say, a lot of European countries started a very, I would say, in-depth self-reflection on their capacity to actually look at the potentials of AI in a much wider perspective, not only at industrial level, so at the governance level. And there we had a few different few different models, even inside the European cosmos. One model looking at a much wider perspective of artificial intelligence in general. So, but starting from the industrial point of view, so is adapting artificial intelligence to the Industry 4.0 revolution. And you had other models that at the beginning seemed to be less important, like the model made up by Italy and Finland, starting reflecting about a two-road artificial intelligence governance, one artificial intelligence governance for the public sector, and one broader model for the industrial sector. And this model is actually the one that was taken more by the Latin American countries, where you have there a lot of difference, let's say, by having 4 or 5 leading digital countries, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil to some extent, and Chile trying to ramp, and Uruguay for sure. And then you have other countries that were really left behind. And I think that the same situation applies to Africa to some extent, where you have, for sure, for example, countries like Rwanda or that have been trying to put a massive gear into the adoption of a stronger artificial intelligence process. But here, I think that we are looking at, for example, you mentioned Latin America and being it behind. I think it is behind to some extent, but not everywhere. I think that the adoption, for example, of artificial intelligence in the justice system in Latin America is to some extent much more advanced than in other European countries. And there is another big reflection that we have to make, and I think I will leave you here to give space to the others. But there is an important reflection to be made about the way the reasoning of artificial intelligence is done. And I think that not by a chance, the European Union actually released the data strategy and the artificial intelligence white paper in the same time. I think that without a clear ethical conception of how we handle data, we cannot progress in the way we see artificial intelligence coming. And I think that this is like pivotal. Building on this, the European Union is right now the third big giant in the race, I would say, and but is a much more constructive racer. The newly established International Alliance for Human-Centric Approach to Artificial Intelligence is one of those examples where a combination of competences coming both from the industrial sector, from the public policy perspective, but as well from the third sector, or let's say the civil society sector, is making an enormous difference in how we conceptualize artificial intelligence in the future.
So, Francesco, before actually going to you, sorry, because I just want to follow up on what Enzo was saying, and he was describing this kind of different stages of the race and different kind of interpretations. And perhaps to give you a picture of where the race stands right now, I think that I'd like Elena to show us a little bit in a graphic way. Where do we stand in the adoption and development of AI and use of data? And then perhaps we can use that picture to then discuss the European model and how we can kind of compete with the dramatic images that you're going to show us, Elena.
Thank you, Francesco. If I may ask for the slides, oh, wonderful. So I'm going to be presenting a work that I've been doing together recently with Joanna Bryson from the Hertie School, and starting with this slide, which is not our work, to be very open. And however, I suspect that it's a slide that many of you, if not all, have seen before. And I've been asked, what is this? So just as because it's figures, I should say. So I've seen this slide, and I've seen many variations thereof. So if you go to the next slide. So if you go, this slide is everywhere. So this slide that is representing American companies versus European companies versus Asian companies in this exact form has been reproduced. If you click one more time, we see, for example, in a very similar form here below, even in a CEPS document. So it's really influencing the policy discussion in Europe. Can you go back with the slides? Sorry, it's unusual. Yeah, voila. So I just want to say, when I saw it first, I was like, this is strange. So here we see platform companies, it's called platform companies. There is not a consensual definition of what a platform is. And looking at it, I've also seen that basically it seems like the US is some kind of NASDAQ-inspired market capitalizations of big companies, but there is not the companies that are on the New York Stock Exchange are excluded. Then, so it doesn't seem to be like based on a very clear filter. And looking really at it, I also was surprised. There is obviously a kind of consumer household product bias, because you see a lot of companies that people know. So for example, Spotify in Europe, but Europe of course has a lot of platform technology. And if we transpose this to AI, which was done by others before, B2B type of technologies. So we were really concerned looking at this, that this is not showing at all a complete picture. It's a bit of a misrepresentation of the insignificance here. Clearly, this was used to point to the insignificance of Europe by basically not really applying a clear selection criteria as to who is going on the chart. And we see here a clear, basically the US is the GAFAs. So if you go the slides, okay, thank you, one more. Voila. So here we see also that this slide, which in principle is not showing China in the bucket, is actually has been presented as a China story. So really showing Europe as I think Francesco mentioned, this Europe squeeze between only two variations, which is the US and here relabeled in the top of the chart China. So if you click once, just to and then indeed this is being now related to, is being used to say, oh, this is all the fault of the GDPR, we are falling behind. So, and again here on the top of this tweet, which I sort of anonymized a little bit, we are saying this is, we use this for policy discussions with regulators, right? Like we have to do something, this is dangerous, we should not, like we are, because of our regulation, our Europe's human-centric, if you want to call it, model, we are falling behind. So with Joanna Bryson for a few weeks now, almost months, we have been collecting something that is a kind of a counter narrative, or at least a verification of the narrative. And finally, I'm coming to our version of this. Next slide. Ah, it worked. So here what we did is we gathered data from patents, so that in a specific AI technology, so as much as platforms don't have like a bucket in technology, it's really a judgment call many times, like what is a platform? At least there is a lot of academic debate about this. AI, there are again also a debate about what technologies are AI, but in the classification by the patent offices, there is a consensus that that certain categories are AI, in particular the one we use. So this is the G06N from the World Patent Office. We use this category. We took all the companies that have patented at least 2 patents in 2019 with this WIPO office, in order not to have a geographic bias. And we have plotted their market capitalization on a chart. Now here you see that the picture is not completely different, but it's a little bit different. So the companies in gray are the US companies. The companies in blue are European companies, so companies from the EEA that are subject to the GDPR, and China is pink. So already we don't really see like China and US, and we see what we really want to bring out here is this yellow. So the yellow dimension, which is companies that are not from either of these free geographic regions that have a national or regional strong regulation. And we see that there are very many. And for example, one of the huge companies in the world, as you know, is Aramco, the Saudi Aramco. We have the Swiss companies and we have Japanese companies. So this is basically where what we put together so far, just to have a little bit something not completely different, but a little bit more nuanced.
Thank you. I mean, everybody is talking about your graph, and I think it's incredibly interesting to look at, especially because of the yellow, basically. I think that one big misunderstanding about artificial intelligence, and when I hear most people talking about it, is that they're comparing to technologies that have a profoundly different kind of a technological basis. So if you compare it to the ability to exploit, for example, energy or create energy, atomic energy, or all the technology of the past, I think that the comparison doesn't fit because artificial intelligence works in very different ways. You have a couple of students that can compete with the big corporations creating products that exceed the specifications of this. I'll give you an example that Stefan gave me many years ago. If you think about Google Translate versus DeepL, DeepL it's an AI-based translation application that is vastly superior to the one that Google Translate is providing with a very different economy. Now, thank you very much for this picture. So I'd like now to kind of move and conclude a little bit here. There is this kind of a big competition between geopolitical spheres. This graph still indicates the dominance of the of the US kind of economic model for technology. China is clearly competing in that same area, and Europe seems to be almost invisible in that graph. Now, I think that we have an advantage in having kind of, as I said, what I was describing as the soft power regulation, but also of cultural and value systems. So I would like to ask to Francesco to tell us if Europe can learn anything from the American, not so much, but the Chinese model. I'm saying the American not so much because we're traditional allies. Is there anything that we can learn from China? And then my question for Krui, who's been a member of the European expert group on artificial intelligence, and Stefan, who's the theorist here, is how can we think about artificial intelligence and humanity? What are the macro dimensions, the values that we see in the development of artificial intelligence, and how can Europe be a kind of a leading voice in creating this cultural dimension? And how, what are the philosophical implications of this transformation? So perhaps, Francesco, you can tell us what can we learn from China to compete with China?
Thanks a lot, Francesco. Well, first of all, I'm sorry that I jumped into the discussion late, so I do not fully know what did you tell each other. Also, I have another small problem, which is it's not completely clear to me what do you mean by artificial intelligence, but this is a question of definition. Elena was talking about global platform and the debate about defining global platform. I think the problem with artificial intelligence is even bigger. So I would probably try to say something about sort of more generically, give my impression of which is the competitive advantage that the Chinese have in terms of using technologies, which also tries to answer Francesco's question about what could we learn from them. I think they have the huge advantage of having problems to be solved. They have concrete problems to be solved. In a sense, their advantage is also that they still are relatively poor. In fact, I mean, per income, a Chinese is today poorer than an Argentinian, notwithstanding all the sort of financial problems that Argentina has had in the last couple of decades. And they still remember when in 1989, Tiananmen, so 30 years ago, 31 years ago, China was the poorer country of the world in terms of income per habitant. So they have very concrete problems to be solved, and this sort of give them some cognitive advantage. No, in other words, they immediately think about how to use technologies to better off the lives of people. And this is very much also sort of close to talking about definition. The classic definition of innovation, no? The Latin used to say, but this also applies to the British, that necessity is a mother of innovation. In other words, you know, you need you also need to have some some problems in terms of survival, you know, to use innovation technologies and artificial intelligence, whatever artificial intelligence is, effectively. No, this is quite. I mean, I was comparing with Francesco couple of weeks ago the case of Japan in early 90s and the case of China now. There is a big difference between Japan and China, and one is that Japan challenged partially partially unsuccessfully America in the early 90s, starting from a position where they more or less had the same, you know, prosperity of America. China is completely different. And to me, what China can teach, not very much to Italy, but to sort of less developed countries, is how to leapfrog, no? Talking about Africa, but also talking about systems where, for instance, the judiciary system is not so consolidated. There is not so much legacy. Probably it's a more quicker, effective, efficient to use technology to change things. In Europe, where we have you know some legacy, everything is more complicated. Of course, it's not easy neither to become poor, to be more technologically efficient, nor to import dictatorship to be more efficient from a technological point of view. However, what I can say is that, for instance, COVID, you didn't mention COVID-19, the emergency that we are witnessing now. I mean, that is, to me, a very clear, huge example of European and American failure, period. I mean, looking to numbers, the numbers are embarrassing. You may argue that the Asian numbers, it's not just China, Asian numbers are, how can I say, arguable, but the magnitude of the comparison is embarrassing for the West. We are talking about two parts of the world, Europe and America, by the way, where 10% of the population lives, where 80% of the public health expenditure on healthcare happens. Europe is the welfare superpower, and yet if you combine, if you sum Europe and America, you have 2/3 of the cases and even more of the deaths. And the COVID was a very clear example, a big opportunity to use the so-called quote-unquote big data to give some substance to this world. And this is a big, big failure. This is just to say that I am very affectionate to Europe, but I think that the challenge is very huge because we are talking even about probably the survival of our system.
Thank you. I really appreciated you putting in perspective the advantage they have of necessity being the mother of innovation and the pragmatic dimension that China has to pursue because of the to improve the conditions of society. I'd like to build up on that to talk with Gru about who's been very active in talking about the European advantage and cultural advantage, if you wish. she's been writing about human-centric artificial intelligence for a while, and as I told you, she's been a member of the high-level group on artificial intelligence, the European high-level group on artificial intelligence. Can you tell me what do you think is the advantage of the European model versus, for example, the one Francesco was talking about, the pragmatic Chinese model?
Well, thank you, Francesco, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this. It's been incredibly interesting to listen to all the other participants. Now, now when we're talking about this, you have to think, it makes me think that power is a very interesting thing. So when we're talking about this geopolitics and technological change and gaining a technological momentum, then I think the key question we have to ask ourselves is, what kind of power do we want? So, for example, a democracy is a very specific kind of power, and we have it expressed in our institutions and in our technologies and also in the tools and crafts that we build. And now when we're talking about our socio-technical environments, particularly in these. So right now, as many have been pointing out, there's different, what we could say, technological cultures competing for this momentum in framing the practices for creating, for example, something like AI and big data, this kind of interoperable global market and space. But so a technological momentum is also usually a cultural compromise, or it's a dominion of one culture over another, or at least that's the case if we want to build these kind of infrastructures that works, where standard works, that are effective and that can operate together. So this is particularly here. I think it's really important that we're very aware of what kind of power we give ourselves when we design the different components of technologies, as for example AI. We want democratic powers, monopolistic powers, authoritarian or totalitarian powers to be very, very straightforward about that. So we clearly had one kind of cultural tech dominion in the big data technology environments in the 2010s. So, and this is also, as we've seen, as Helena was just showing on the maps, it's been extended into the AI domain. So, for example, in the Western Hemisphere, we have this clear dominance of the Silicon Valley cultural model in the consumer technology space. So there's this idea about moving fast, breaking things, innovate in legal gray zones that would usually include kind of challenging data protection laws, or this idea that the more data, the better. So, collect until you drop. And so we've also seen the direct effects on this idea of democracy and what democracy means to us. So we have examples like Cambridge Analytica, mass surveillance scandals, big tech digital platform monopolies. And then here in the 2010s, mostly at the end of the time, I've been following this development for quite a while, and also been very strongly participating in it. There's this counter policy and technology and business movement. Mostly it's bringing from Europe with kind of alternative ways of creating things like data design, and based on, for example, these things like personal data management systems and data trust and different business models that do not profit from data tracking, for example. And this also means that we right now have this very explicit cultural clash between different ways of dealing with the data of AI, for example. We could call it different data cultures. And they're competing in very, very, very concrete ways, in the way that they pose the engineering and business problems, and they propose the solutions in very, very concrete terms. So when we talk about the human-centric approach, it means something very specific in terms of very specific design components in relation to human agency, privacy by design, non-discrimination. We've heard all these things now. And Carolina was asking for something very practical. So, for example, in the high-level group, we developed this ALT-I assessment tool where you can kind of, you go and check that, you can see what it actually means in very practical terms for AI practitioners. So just, you know, the last note to conclude, you know, I could talk, and which we've also talked a lot about, and these debates are very much framed in terms of competitive advantages for the European approach, but I actually think it's so much more important when we talk about the geopolitical conversation, and also in terms of when we have a critical moment like this, that we consider that we need to build technologies for democracies, not authoritarian states or monopolistic markets or these things. This was a very high-flying, but I think that sometimes it's important to go back to basics. Thank you.
So I intentionally left Stefan to respond last on the picture we created, because he's constantly provided me with some of the most interesting macro level analysis of what all this means. So I'd like to ask Stefan to elaborate on what he sees in this picture, and what do you think is gonna emerge from this competition? What are the possible scenarios? And perhaps if you can offer even a longer term kind of future view of what the challenges are going to be and where we're going towards.
Yeah, many thanks. There have been a lot of interesting and important points you've been raised, and I like to refer to quite a few of them. So Helena, yeah, your slide was enormously important because it also highlighted that the countries in which the countries in which sort of the use of AI platforms are flourishing are the ones in which the data protection is not as rigid as it is in Europe. And that applies, I mean, you've shown like Samsung, Saudi Arabia, South Korea. And so it seems to be an enormously important point for economic flourishing to be able to use the data. The question is, how is it structured? So, and that's an important shift which is currently taking place as a consequence of what we saw, which is going on in China, and Paul referred to it with the example of TikTok. So for the first time, we used to think the internet is a global entity. But what actually takes place now with China and also with Russia is a localization of the internet. It's not only a global, but also a local entity, because here China is creating the Chinese firewalls. If you want to collect the data in China, or if you want to get hold of the Chinese market, you need to subscribe to the Chinese rules. And that's why YouTube and Facebook are not there. So the Chinese have got the possibility of collecting the data in China, but also in the global, in the rest of the world. And Russia is heading into a similar direction because of the importance of collecting the data. Francesca, you were referring to sort of alternatives. On the one hand, you said, yeah, in the US, it's for marketing purposes. And then you stressed in China, it is more for authoritarian, it's for social control. But it is not just for social control. And that's I think, one of the issues which we really need to focus on, why it is so important to have that data. And here I'm referring to something Gabriele stressed, and also Condaine. Gabriele stressed, you said, sort of, we are worried concerning the collection of biometric data. You particularly focused on face recognition. And Condaine, you stressed the importance of health and the application of AI to the field of health. And I think this is one of the elements which we really need to take enormously seriously, because the implications of the collection of data, in particular for increasing the health span, promoting health, are extremely important. And that's what we can already see when we take into consideration who's publishing peer-reviewed papers. And by now, China has already overtaken the United States. There are more papers published in peer-reviewed journals, scientific papers being published, than in the United States. That's a significant shift. When there was a discussion whether AI is taking away our jobs, then in that famous study, it was still included that basically there's no risk of physicians being automatized or being taken away by digitalization. This no longer applies because we nowadays realize that that visual recognition, picture recognition, which used to be a challenge for AIs, they are now working better with recognizing tumors than radiologists. So the capacities related to the AI, in particular also to the field of scientific research in the field of medicine, are enormous. And that's why they are so important. They're not just for advertising or social control, but we need the digital data also for policy making. We need it for research in the natural sciences, in the social sciences, but in particular in the field of sort of medicine in a wide sense. And that's why, and yeah, Francesco, you were referring to that and sort of the importance on how much good can come out of it by collecting the data, in particular when it comes also to dealing with the pandemic. And so the European way of doing with it, the general data protection regulation undermines the possibility of collecting the data in the appropriate manner. It is, and it's not just the case that there has to be a conflict with data collection and democracy. And this is what I particularly wish to stress. Yeah, Gri, you're perfectly right. This is a central and fundamental point to focus. What a wonderful achievement liberal democracies are. And we need to cherish them and preserve them. And so, and we need to try to accommodate these developments. On the one hand, the importance of collecting digital data, in particular also for the field of health and medical research, scientific research. But on the other hand, it mustn't undermine the structures of a liberal democracy. So the question I was asking and I dealt with sort of how can this be done? So what is one of the central reasons why we cherish privacy? And there are two central foundations. One is the fear of sanctions, and the other is it's our intellectual property. And sort of we fear that our intellectual property gets taken away if someone simply takes our digital data. And we freely give it away. We freely give it in the US and with Facebook and Google, and they're making loads of money with it. In China, it's taken away for different purposes. So I think what we need to develop is a European alternative, a democratic usage of the data, so which actually takes seriously the enormous impact for human flourishing, for the field of the health span expansion. And one way, for example, of doing this could be by collecting the data in a political manner. And I know this it sounds scary, and it scares me personally as well. But we need to take, I mean, as I described that before, we need to take seriously the importance of the digital data and what can be done with it. But if it gets collected and stored safely, processed, accessed primarily by algorithms, artificial intelligence, not primarily by humans, because humans use it against other humans, then we can use the personalized data for scientific purposes. And in this way, it's not taken away from us. It's not necessarily taken away from us, but it needs to be used in a democratic manner. And what does it mean? We need it, this taking away and the usage of the data can be seen as a payment for a wonderful European achievement, namely the public health insurances, which are enormously costly. And we want to uphold the quality of these public health insurances. But in order to do so, we need the money and the financial flourishing. And that's why we simply cannot refuse the usage of the digital data. And sort of a democratic usage of the data would be if it could be seen, collected, but collected, stored, processed, collected also in a personalized manner, but primarily processed by algorithms so that it's safe from human intervention. And it could be seen as a partial payment, at least for a public health insurance, which we provide, so that we can uphold the level of what we currently have and maybe improve it even further. And that would be seen as a way of resolving the conflict of sort of data collection on the one hand, and the wonderful achievement of a liberal democracy. And so there doesn't have to be a conflict between these two things. So by giving up privacy, we collect the digital data, but we use it for a democratic manner.
Thank you very much, Stefan. It's such a wonderful conversation we have been able to build, and there's so much that can be said. We are way over time, but I want to ask one last question to Paul. He's been directly involved in overseeing some kind of pivotal moments in the European approach to creating this European model, both in terms of the regulation of data and private data, something that Stefan was referring to, but also in trying to foster the necessary kind of attempts to communicate, integrate, and find some common grounds with other cultural and political and geopolitical kind of forces. Now, we have described different models, the European, in some dimensions of the European, the United States model. We have looked at the global South, looked at China. Stefan, as always, has been able to cross boundaries in his statements. The reality is that I see a profound challenge for the future, because despite the pragmatic quality, almost scientific ability of Chinese to resolve problems, I still do believe that the European value system, based on certain values, ethics, respect for privacy, respect of identity, ethnicity, and a long list of values, are something that I treasure and that probably I'm not willing to compromise for the sake of pragmatic resolution of problems. But I recognize that we need to create bridges. So what are the challenges, and can we really, and how do we approach this idea of collaborating with these other geopolitical interpretations of artificial intelligence?
Well, I would say over the last 2 or 3 years, collaboration both with the United States and also China has not become easier. I don't need to explain that for the United States. In relation to China, the wording and atmosphere has also changed. We have moved from nice wording of collaboration to strategic competition, describing our relationship to China. And let us not forget that absolutist ambitions, which we find in the dictatorship in Peking, as much as we find them in some of the heads of those preaching technology as the solution for everything, put democracy into a squeeze, namely between these absolutist models, either the great technology, which is the great solution, and actually we don't need democracy anymore, let's just do all what is technologically possible, let's move on to singularity and so on. And that is an absolutist claim, with here and there, I would say, coming pretty close to the absolutist claims which the Chinese Communist Party has over its people in herding the people by technology. After all, it is the dream of the communists since the Russian Revolution to fulfill communism through technology. In the old times, it was the steel factories and building houses and a good car is the great progress in East Germany, in the 50s and 60s. And today, the dream of the Communist Party is to fulfill communism by complete control and nudging of the behavior of its people. So I would say that we must revive the Frankfurt School of a critical attitude towards power. We must revive democracy, and a critical attitude towards power these days, and this is new, I would say, implies a critical attitude towards technology, because technology as such gains ever more power and colonializes our world. And I'm in the minority of those in the Commission and in Brussels who say it is our discourse on people needing to learn to trust technology is not a good one. It's a dangerous one. And so I would say that in terms of cooperation, we need a lot of cooperation, which is of a multidisciplinary nature. And the discussion today for me was very inspiring in this respect, but we must, of course, include also, let's say, those who are working and are knowledgeable about these technologies themselves. It's very important to have debates with lawyers, philosophers, political scientists, economists, and the technologists. That is the first level of cooperation, which I think where we have to get stronger, because as many have said here, these are power technologies. And these are technologies which have much more impacts than just in the economy. They have impacts in democracy. They touch on the essential of our ability to be free humans. And the second element of cooperation where we must get much better is, of course, the cooperation in Europe between member states, but also the cooperation between public and private sector, but at arm's length. I have to say, the way Silicon Valley believes cooperation is going, namely Google buys all the researchers' friendly expertises. Yeah, you don't find any research center in Europe anymore on social impacts of AI, where not one of the big funders of Silicon Valley is somehow present. That is not the type of cooperation, I think, which we need. We need to reinstall the ability and the calling, both in research and in the free press, to deliver truth. And that doesn't work if both the free press and science become dependent on the big money flows which come from the tech giants in Silicon Valley. So I would say, to conclude my contribution here, the fight of the future is not in the first place a fight and a competition on technology. It is a fight and competition about societal models and the question of how we want to live. And if we want to continue to live in freedom and with functioning democracies, this is what we have to invest in first. But of course, we must also be able to continue to thrive in terms of economic growth and innovation. Now, I could start a long lecture on why, for example, patents are not.
I have to say that I couldn't have wished for a more powerful conclusion, and they are red flagging me because we exceeded our time by a long kind of 20 minutes or more. I think it's been an absolute privilege to listen to you. I go out of this conversation enriched by many views, and this is not going to be the last. And I want to thank you all for your absolutely inspiring contribution, and I mean it. It's not like just something that I have to say. And I would like to thank the festival for hosting us, and I look forward to have more conversations with you on this topic, which is going to be on our agenda for decades to come. So thank you very much to all, and we'll be in touch soon. Thank you for the ones that have been following and have been patient to follow until now. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a
Bye-bye.
good weekend. Bye.